I have served the Dukes of Aldermore for 30 years, and in all that time I had never once heard my master ask a question he did not already know the cruel answer to. So when he stood at the tall window that gray October morning, watching the rain drown his gardens, and said, "Josiah, do you think there is a single honest kindness left in the whole of my county?" I knew he was not asking. He was accusing. He was accusing the world, as he had accused it every day of the 3 years since the fever took his brother and left him the last of the veins above the ground. "I think there is a great deal of it, my lord," I said, because it was true, and because someone in that cold house had to say it and no one else dared. He turned from the window. Alaric Vane, the 4th Duke of Aldermore, 36 and already gray at the temples, with a face that servants crossed themselves against and mothers used to frighten children into their beds. The cold Duke, they called him in the villages, when they thought no one of the house was near. The Duke who had not smiled since the burying. He looked at me the way he looked at a column of figures that would not add. "Kindness," he said, "is a coin the poor spend on the rich, hoping for change. Every smile in this house is bought, Josiah, every bow, every God keep your grace. They keep me sweet because I keep them fed. Take away the gold and you take away the love, and there is nothing underneath but teeth." He said it without heat, and that was the worst of it. A man who rages can be argued out of his rage. A man who has grown quiet in his contempt has built a house there and hung the curtains and means to die in it. I had watched him build that house room by room. It had not always stood. As a young man he had laughed, I had heard it. I remembered it the way you remember weather from your childhood. But he and his brother Edmund had been two halves of one bright thing, and when the fever came through in the bad winter and took Edmund in 4 days and spared Alaric by no reason any physician could name, the laughing half went into the ground, and the surviving half went cold to keep from feeling the frost. He had nursed his brother himself at the last, when the physicians fled the sick room for fear of the contagion. He had held Edmund's hand and promised him the world would be looked after, and then he had walked out of that room, a man who believed the world was not worth the looking after, because it had let a good man die and kept a hard one alive. "Then prove it, my lord," I said. I do not know what possessed me. 30 years of service, and I had never once thrown a dare at his feet. But I was old, and I was tired of watching a good man freeze himself to death by inches in a house full of fires, and the words came out before I could catch them by the tail. He raised one eyebrow. The whole of his surprise in that man lived in a single eyebrow. "Prove it. Go among them as no one. Not the Duke, not the purse. A poor traveler with mud on his coat and an empty belly and nothing in his pockets. Ride your own lands with your face turned away, and see whether one soul in the whole of Aldermore will show a stranger a kindness that buys them not 1 farthing. If not one will, then you are right, my lord, and I am an old fool, and I will never say the word kindness to you again as long as I live." I paused. "And if one will?" "There will be no if one will," he said. But something had lit behind his eyes, not hope. He had buried hope with his brother, but the hard pleasure of a man certain he is about to win an argument he has waged with himself for years. "Very well. We ride out tomorrow, both of us plain. And when we come back cold and turned away from every door in the county, Josiah, you will hold your tongue on the goodness of men for the rest of your natural life. Is it a bargain?" "It is, my lord," I said, "if I lose." I did not think I would lose the whole of it. I thought only that a fortnight of shut doors, with here and there a bit of bread pressed on us by some poor cottager, might crack the ice enough to let a little truth back in, that he might see one woman share her supper, one farmer point a stranger to shelter, and remember that the world was not all teeth. I am a foolish old man. I had aimed at cracking the ice. I did not know I was aiming his whole life at a cottage in Marin-Coombe, at a girl with a healer's hands, and at the one door in all of Aldermore that would open. We rode out the next morning in the plainest coats the house could furnish, on 2 rough-coated horses no gentleman would look at twice, and we told the steward we were gone north on the Duke's private business, which was near enough to true that no one questioned it. I had thought we would keep to the good roads and the market towns, where a stranger is common and a kindness costs little. But my master, once set upon a thing, does it to the bone. He turned us off the highway within the hour, onto the wet lanes that thread the western edge of his own lands, where the tenants had never seen his face closer than a carriage window flashing past, and where a poor man on a poor horse was only a poor man on a poor horse. For 4 days the county proved me a liar, and I watched him grow colder and quieter with every mile, and every mile I lost a little more of my old man's faith. The first door was a prosperous farm below Herringstoke, with a fat rick in the yard and smoke fat in the chimney. We asked for no more than a heel of bread and leave to shelter in the barn from the rain. The farmer's wife came to the door, and she looked at his mud and my gray hairs, and she looked past us at the empty lane to see there was no witness to shame her, and she said the dogs would be loosed if we did not move along, and shut the door so hard the latch jumped on its nail. I heard the dogs begin to bay behind it as we turned away. The second was an inn at a crossroads, the Bell, with a warm window and a good fire I could see from the road. The landlord came out into the yard wiping his hands, and he counted the poverty of our coats before we had got a full sentence out, and told us the beds were every one full, though I could see with my own eyes the yard was empty of horses and the upper windows dark and shuttered. He said it kindly enough. He said there was a barn 3 miles on where tramps sometimes lay, and he'd not tell if we did, and he went back into his warm room and shut the door on the 2 of us in the rain, and I have thought since that his was the cruelest kindness of all, the sort that gives you directions to your own misery and calls it charity. The third was worse for being so small. We stood in the market square of a little town with the rain coming sideways off the moor, and my master, humbling himself in a way I had never seen him do, stopped a fat merchant in a good coat and asked only the way to the next village. And the merchant stepped around us the way a man steps around a puddle, without so much as turning his head, as though a poor man asking a question were a kind of whether you simply waited out. A boy laughed. Somewhere a woman pulled her child closer as we passed, as if poverty were a thing that jumped from coat to coat. "Well, Josiah," my master said, on the 3rd night, in a broken byre we had crept into because no roof had been offered. The rain drummed on the rotten thatch and found us through it in a dozen cold places. He had not eaten since the morning, and neither had I. There was a cut on his hand from a bramble that had begun to swell and redden in the wet, and he would not let me tend it, because tending it would have meant admitting we were reduced to doctoring our own hurts in the dark like beasts in a ditch. "Say the word kindness to me now. Go on. Say it, and I will listen." I could not. That is the shame of it, and I set it down plainly so you will understand what came after. I sat in the wet straw with my back to the cold stone, and I could not say the word, because 3 days of shut doors had emptied my mouth of it, and I am ashamed to this hour that a thing so true could be argued out of an old man so easily by a little cold and a little hunger and a little contempt. He heard my silence, and he nodded slow, like a judge passing a sentence he takes no joy in, and he lay down in the straw with his swelling hand cradled to his chest, and he slept the sleep of a man who has been proved right, which is the loneliest sleep there is. I did not sleep. I lay in the dark and I prayed, in the plain way an old servant prays, not for a sign or a wonder, only for one open door somewhere down the road, one poor soul who would put the lie to what my master was learning. I did not know I was praying us straight into Marin Coombe. We came down into that valley the 4th day, a little cup of a place with a dozen crooked cottages, and a stream running bright through the middle and one lopsided church leaning on its own graveyard, and it was so quiet and so poor and so out of the way that I remember thinking, here at least no one will have the means to be cruel. A man cannot loose dogs he cannot feed. I did not know, riding down that leaf-slick lane in the thin rain, that I was riding down into the whole rest of my master's life. His horse cast a shoe on the flint of the descent, and then, before I could get down to look to it, The poor tired beast set its unshod foot into a rut hidden under the wet leaves and went over sideways, and my master went with it. Hard. Into the stones. His hurt hand flung out to break the fall, and the whole weight of him coming down upon it. I heard the crack of him hitting the road, and I heard him make a sound I had not heard him make in 30 years. A short, broken, involuntary sound. The sound of a body past the reach of pride. And then he was down on the stones in the rain with his wrist bent wrong beneath him and his brow laid open on a flint. And the blood running down his gray face made him look at last, exactly like the thing we had dressed him as. A poor broken traveler no one in all the world would trouble to weep for. I got him up. God knows how. An old man hauling a tall one, but terror lends an old man strength he has no business having, and I got him sitting against the low churchyard wall with my folded coat behind his head, and I ran for the nearest door. It was the parson's, snug beside the church. I hammered on it, and a thin, frightened face came to the crack, and I said there was a man hurt bad in the road, bleeding from the head, his arm broken beneath him, and the thin face said, "I will carry this to my grave." The thin face said, "Is he one of ours?" As if the blood of a stranger were a different color on the stones. As if grace kept a parish register and checked your name against it before it would spend itself on you. I said he was a traveler, a poor man passing through, and the door closed, gently this time, and I heard the bolt slide, and through the wood, faint, the parson's voice telling someone within that vagrants carried the low fever down from the towns, and it was no Christian's duty to bring the fever into a house where there were children to think of. I ran to the next door, and it did not open at all, and the next. Curtains twitched and stilled. A face or two showed pale at a window, looked out at the two ragged strangers, one of them bleeding against the churchyard wall in the rain, and drew back and looked away. The way you look away from a thing you have privately decided is not your affair. The rain came harder. My master's blood ran pink and thin down the wall stones behind his head. And I stood in the middle of that little forgotten village in the failing gray light, and I understood, with a grief I have not the words for even now, that he had been right in everything, that I had staked my whole faith in the goodness of men and lost it door by door, and that we were going to sit against a cold wall in a strange place while he worsened, and that there was not one soul in all of Marin Coombe who would cross their own threshold for us. Let me look at him. I turned. A young woman had come up the lane through the rain with a covered basket on her arm and her hood fallen back off her hair, heedless of the wet, and she was already going past me, as though I were a gatepost, and down on her knees in the mud beside my master, already turning his gray, bloodied face gently toward what light there was to see the depth of the cut, already lifting his broken wrist between two fingers, so careful and so knowing that he, half fainting, did not so much as cry out. She was perhaps 23, plainly dressed, a working dress with the sleeves already pinned back from some earlier labor, a healer's dress. And her hands, I noticed her hands first. Everyone did, always. Her hands were quick and sure and wholly unafraid. Hands that had held a very great deal of other people's pain, and had made their peace with it long ago. He's bleeding into his eye. Hold his head so. No, so. She was not asking my leave for anything. She was arranging me like a tool she happened to need. The wrist is broken and not the arm, thank God, and a clean break at that. I can set it. Is he your master? My friend, I said, remembering our lie a full beat too late. We travel together. We've no money for a physician, mistress. I'll not deceive you on that. Did I ask you for money? She said, and glanced up at me once through the rain, and I have never in all my life felt so gently and so completely rebuked. Can he stand if we take his weight between us? Between us, we got him up. My cold, proud master, half out of his senses, leaned the whole of his weight on the shoulder of a poor girl he had never seen before in his life, and she took it as though it weighed nothing, and she led us, not back to the church that had bolted its door, not to any of the snug cottages with the twitching curtains, but away down the lane and over a plank bridge across the stream to a low cottage at the very furthest edge of the village. the last house, the poorest. Its thatch patched in 3 colors, and its garden a wild dark tangle of herbs gone to seed in the autumn wet. The healer's cottage, where the sick of the valley came when the physician's fee in the town was more than a poor life was reckoned worth. She got him onto a straw pallet by her fire. She sent me out for water from the butt and clean linen from a chest while she cleaned the wound on his brow with a steady unhurried hand, talking to him low the whole while, though he was scarce conscious of it. There now. There. You've had a hard fall, but you're safe now. Do you hear me? You're safe. I have you. The voice a woman uses on a frightened animal or a frightened child, and it worked on my proud master as it works on a child, and I saw the fright go out of his half-shut eyes at the sound of it. She set the wrist. I have seen town surgeons do it worse and charge a guinea. She bound it to a splint of smooth willow she had by her, peeled and ready, as though she had somehow known a broken traveler was coming down the lane that day and would need it. She spooned a bitter dark draught between his lips against the pain and against the fever. She said, matter of fact, was coming and could not be stopped, only weathered. And when at last he slept, truly slept, warm and dry and out of the rain for the first time in 4 days, she sat back on her heels and pushed her own wet hair off her brow with the back of her wrist and looked at me. And only then, only when the work was wholly done and the stranger was safe, did she seem to remember that she herself was cold and soaked through and tired to the bone. You'll both of you stay the night, she said. He can't be moved before morning, and you'll find no other roof in the coombe, I promise you that. There's a place by the fire for you, and there's soup. It's only barley and what the garden gives this time of year, but it's hot, and hot is the thing. She saw something come into my face, I do not know what, everything, I think, everything of those 4 days at once, and she misread it entirely for pride. You needn't fear to take it. We've little enough, but there's always enough to have. My mother used to say the pot stretches for the one who's welcome in it. I sat down by that poor smoky fire in that poor patched cottage, and I ate a bowl of barley soup made hot with an open hand, and I am not too proud at my years to tell you that an old man wept quietly into it, turned toward the fire so the girl should not see. Not for the soup, though I had not eaten in a day. For the 3 days of shut doors, and the 4th day of blood running down a churchyard wall, and for my master sleeping safe at last under a patched roof at the very edge of a village, saved by the one door in all his own broad county that had opened to him, and it the poorest door of all, held by the poorest hand. I did not tell her who he was. I want that clearly understood before I go on, for I am not proud of the month of small lies that followed, and I would not have you think I told them lightly. But I had an old servant's instinct, sitting by that fire, that the name Aldermore spoken aloud in that cottage would change everything in it at a stroke, and might crush some tender thing before it had ever had the chance to stand. So when she asked next morning what my friend was called, I said Alaric, which was his own true name, and that he was a land steward's man fallen on hard times and traveling to seek a new place, which was every word a lie, and she nodded and asked nothing further, because she was the sort who understood without being told that a man's history is his own to give out or to keep as he chooses. Her name was Verity Sparrow. Her father, Thomas Sparrow, had been the bone setter and herb doctor of the whole valley for 40 years and lay now in the inner room, wasted small and light as a bundle of kindling by a slow sickness in the lungs that all his own long craft and his daughters could not turn back, dying by patient inches and knowing it to the day, and bearing it with a dry good humor that broke my heart worse than any weeping could have done. She had learned the whole of her art at his knee, from a girl. She could set a bone and draw a fever and midwife a birth gone wrong and close a wound so it did not fester, and she did all of it for the whole valley, and the whole valley let her. I say let her, and I mean the words exactly as I set them down. Over those first days, waiting for my master's fever to break and his wrist to knit enough to travel, I learned the true shape of Verity Sparrow's life, and it was this. She gave and gave and gave, and the valley took, and thought nothing of her for the taking, and thought worse of her besides. They came to her door at every hour of the day and night. A carter's child took the croup in the black middle of the night. She rose without a word of complaint and went 3 miles in the dark, and sat up till dawn with the child breathing steam over her basin. A woodman's foot was crushed under a fallen bowl. She left her own cold supper on the table and went and saved the man his leg. And they paid her, when they paid her at all, in a cabbage or a laid egg or a promise for the harvest. And more than one paid her in nothing whatever and grumbled after that the draught had tasted foul or the binding was too tight. And behind her back, I heard it, in the little shop where I went for what small things the cottage needed. For an old man in a plain coat is invisible and hears everything. Behind her back the valley said the ugliest things a place can say of a woman. That her mother, dead these 10 years, had been a cunning woman, and worse than cunning. That the sparrows knew more of the inside of a body than was decent for Christian folk to know. That it was not natural, a young unwed girl who was easy among blood and birthing and the very moment of death, and that the parson had shown good sense in keeping such a household at the arm's length of the pew. The very parson, mark you, who had bolted his door on a bleeding stranger. Now let it be understood from his pulpit that the wasting sickness eating old Thomas Sparrow alive by inches was no misfortune but a judgment, God's own plain verdict on a family that trafficked in knowledge the Almighty had meant to keep hid. And she knew it. That is the thing that undid me more than the shut doors had. She was not a simple soft girl who gave because she was too green to know how her giving was repaid. She knew to the letter what the valley said of her behind its hands, and she knew exactly what her care was worth to them, which was a cabbage and a slander, and she rose at midnight and went to them anyway every time without fail. I asked her once, carefully, in an old man's roundabout fashion, over the grinding of some herb at her table, whether it did not gall her raw to spend her whole young self on people who spoke so ill of her the moment her back was turned. She did not stop her grinding. "My father told me a thing when I was small," she said. "The first time I came home crying that a woman I'd sat up with had called me a witch to her sister at the well the very next morning. He said, 'Verity, you'll meet 2 kinds of people in this work, the kind who deserve your care and the kind who don't, and you'll never once be able to tell the 2 apart with any certainty, so you may as well give it to both and be done fretting over the sorting of them.'" She smiled a little, tired, wry. "And he told me the ones who deserve it the very least are most often the ones who have been given the least of it all their lives, which is exactly why they've gone hard and mean. So." She shrugged and tipped the ground herb into a twist of paper. "I don't do it for their thanks. I should have starved on their thanks years ago. I do it because a hurt is a hurt, whoever's carrying it, and mine are the only hands nearby that know how to ease one." I looked when she said it across the room at my master. He was sitting up by the fire by then, the scab dark on his brow, his splinted wrist in a sling of her weaving, wrapped in a blanket she had woven with her own hands in some winter past, and he was watching her over the rim of his cup, the way a starving man watches bread through a lit window in the cold. And I understood, watching him watch her, that he had heard every word she said, and that something in the whole frozen, locked country of that man had felt, at those words, the first quiet crack and shift of the year's thaw. He would not let me tell her who he was. When we were left alone, she gone out on some errand of mercy, her father asleep in the inner room, I pressed him on it hard. "My lord, we cannot go on deceiving her so. She has broken her bread with us. She has spent her own dear medicines on your fever, medicines she cannot easily replace. She is poor to the bone, and you are the richest man for 40 miles in any direction. And this is not right. It is not honest. Let me only send a quiet word to the hall. Let a purse come by a man who need not say from whom." "No." He said it with a violence I had not heard from him in years, and then at once lower because she might come in at the door. "No, Josiah. Think. If a purse comes from Aldermore to that door, what will she have shown me? Kindness to a duke's man in the hope of a duke's gold. The very thing I said to you at the window. The very teeth I told you were under every smile. He looked into the fire a long moment. I have spent 3 years, Josiah, 3 years, in a certainty as cold and as complete as a stone in winter, that no living soul would ever again show me one moment's true care that my rank and my money had not first paid for. And I have been carried out of the road and mended and warmed and fed, and spoken to like a frightened child by a girl who does not know my name from Adam's, who cannot gain 1 farthing by me, who gives her grace freely to people who slander her from the pulpit of their own church. And I will not spoil the one clean unbought thing I have been shown in 3 years by turning it, with a purse, into just another bargain struck across a counter. Let me be a poor man in her house a little longer. Let me be only Alaric. I have not been merely Alaric to any living creature since Edmund went into the ground. His voice caught and broke on his brother's name. I had not heard it break in 3 years, not once, not at the graveside. I am not ready, Josiah. I am not ready to be the Duke again. Give me a little longer to be a man. So I held my tongue. God forgive me, and I think now that he did. For I held my tongue and let the days run on, and I told myself it did no harm to anyone, and I watched the 2 of them by that fire, and I hoped as an old man hopes, quietly and without much daring too. Because it was not only that he watched her now. She had begun, over those long wet autumn evenings by the fire, while her father slept fitfully in the next room and the rain came down, and there was nothing to do but talk or be silent together, to watch him. Not knowing what he was, believing him a broken steward's man with a mended wrist and no place in the world to go. She had begun to see who he was underneath the coldness he had built like a wall around his grief. And who he was underneath, when you had chipped away enough of the frost to see it, was a man of a terrible deep seriousness and a buried, dry, surprising wit. A man who noticed everything in a room and forgot none of it. A man who could not, it turned out, be lied to, and yet who never once used the truths he saw to wound. A man who had read half the books ever printed and who quoted them softly to her dying father of an evening to make the old man laugh his thin, wheezing laugh. A man who, above all, and this she told me herself later with a kind of wonder still in her voice, a man who could not keep his one good hand still and who mended things. For he could not sit idle, my master. It was not in the making of him, Duke or Beggar. His right wrist was bound, but his left hand was whole and strong. And by the 2nd week he was up and moving slowly about the cottage and the garden, and he began, without a word said, to set the place to rights. The garden gate had hung by its one sound hinge for above a year, dragging a scar in the mud. He found a bit of iron in the lean-to and mended it, cursing under his breath at the awkwardness of a one-handed job, and it swung true after, and I saw her stop dead in the lane when she came home and see it swinging true and not understand for a moment what was different, and then understand, and stand very still. The chimney had smoked the cottage gray all her life. He climbed up cursing and found the old jackdaw's nest that fouled it and cleared it, and the fire drew clean for the first time in years and the room was bright. He rehung a dropped door on its frame. He rethatched the worst leaking corner of the roof over 3 days, one-handed, ruining a shirt and swearing like no duke I ever heard, and like every honest laborer I ever knew. And he sat up with old Thomas Sparrow through the long bad nights, when the coughing would not let the old man lie down to sleep, and talked with him low and easy of horses and philosophy, and the price of wool and the campaigns of dead generals, hour on hour, so that Verity, worn to a thread, could lie down in the next room and sleep a whole night through for the first time in months, knowing her father was not alone in the dark. He did all of it without being asked, and without waiting to be thanked, and I watched the day come when she stopped thinking of him as a burden the rain had washed onto her doorstep, and began, I saw it happen, across a single supper, to think of him as a man whose presence at her fire she had come, without meaning to want there. There was an evening I will set down whole, because I saw it, and because I believe it was the true turning of the thing, before ever Hook came with his paper. Old Thomas had a very bad turn one night. A long fit of the deep coughing that went on and on past bearing until at the last there was bright blood in the cloth she held, more than there had been. And after they had got him settled and shallowly asleep at last, Verity went and stood in the dark of the inner doorway with her back to the room, and her shoulders shook, and she broke quietly, without a sound she would let out. But she broke at last. Because she was 23 years old, and her father was dying in front of her by the day, and she was alone in the whole valley, and there was not one soul in it she could break down in front of and still keep the respect she needed to go on doctoring them. And my master crossed the room to her, slowly. He did not touch her, he was too much a gentleman, even ragged and splinted, and too unsure of his welcome to presume it, but he came and stood close at her back, and he said, "Lo, you do not have to hold him up alone tonight. I am here. Go and lie down. I will sit with him, and if he so much as stirs I will wake you, I give you my word." And she turned in the doorway and looked up at this broken stranger she had pulled out of the road and mended, and something passed between the two of them in the firelight that had no name yet and needed none, and she said, so quiet I barely caught it, "Why are you so kind to us, Alaric? You owe us nothing in the world." "Why?" And he said, "I heard it. God keep the memory of it in me," he said, "because you were kind to me when I had nothing, and did not know that I could never repay you, and did it anyway. I did not think there was such a thing left anywhere under heaven. I find that I cannot stop watching it. I find I do not want to." And she did not answer him, and she did not step away from him either, and after a long moment she let herself, only for a breath, lean her tired head against his shoulder in the dark, and he stood there very still, the way a man stands who has been handed something so fragile he is afraid to breathe upon it and shatter it. And I drew myself back out of that doorway and left the two of them the fire and the rain and the merciful dark. And I went out and sat in the cold byre among the goats, and I thanked God like the old fool I am, weeping again. I am always weeping in this story. An old man's eyes are near the surface, that I had ever in my life dared to say the word kindness to a duke at a window. I thought foolishly in those days that the whole of it would come right on its own now and soon. I thought he had only to speak the truth, to tell her who he was and carry her off up to Aldermore Hall and make her the duchess she was born deserving to be, and that I should live to hear my master laugh again like the young man he had been. I did not reckon on Mr. Hook. I should have. There is always a Mr. Hook. I should say first that I had heard the name before he ever came. Twice, in the little shop, the shopwoman had spoken low of the agent Hook and his enclosing, of hedges going up where none had been and old rights of way stopped with a locked gate. And once an old cottager had said, bitter, that Hook could read a least the way the devil reads Scripture, to his own purpose and never yours, and had turned 3 families off in as many years by finding the crack in the loose old words their grandfathers had trusted. I had marked it as the sort of hard news that has nothing to do with you, and thought no more of it, because I did not yet know it had everything to do with the girl who had saved my master's life. For the Sparrows' cottage, though they had held it 3 generations and more, stood by some old accident of the parish boundaries, some forgotten crook in a line drawn on a map before any of them were born, not upon my master's land at all, but upon the land of a neighboring baronet, one Sir Giles Kelby, an absent, idle, indebted man who lived in the town, and left the whole management of his estate to his agent, and asked no questions of him so long as the rents came up quarterly, and covered his own quarterly follies. And Verity's grandfather had taken the cottage on a lease so old and so loosely, and trustingly worded that no man had troubled to read it closely in 50 years. But a loose lease can be read very close indeed by a man who has decided he wants the ground it sits on. And Mr. Hook had decided he wanted the strip of good black bottom land the cottage and its garden stood upon, to throw into a larger field he was that season enclosing and meaning to let at a fat rent to a grazier from the town. And he had found in the loose old trusting words the crack he needed, that the Sparrows held the place only for the life of the one tenant named in the lease, old Thomas, and that upon Thomas Sparrow's death, which any man with eyes in his head could see, was now a matter of weeks and not of years. The cottage and the garden and the good black land beneath them all reverted clean to the estate, and the daughter, unnamed in the old words, had no more claim upon her own birthplace than a bird has upon last year's nest. He came to tell her so himself, on a bright, hard, cold morning after a week of rain, with two of his men standing off behind him at the gate and a folded paper in his gloved hand. I was in the garden, lifting the last of the roots against the coming frost. My master was within, sitting with Thomas in the inner room. And I stood among the dying bean rows and watched Mr. Hook stand at the mended gate, the gate my master had mended, and tell Verity Sparrow, in the flat, pleasant, reasonable voice of a man, transacting a small tidy piece of business he has done 100 times before, that when her father died she would have 30 days by the letter of the law to quit the only home she had ever known, and that she might take her mother's herbs from the garden and her father's tools from the shed, but that the cottage, the garden, the good land, all of it would go to the plow that same season, and that she would be well advised to begin thinking now, while there was yet time, where a girl of her sort might go. A girl of her sort. He said it kindly, and that was the poison in the cup. There is near always a place, he said, gentling his voice, for a girl who's handy about the sick in a town, in one of the new hospitals of the poor, or in service in a good house if she'd stoop to it, which some are too proud to and come to grief. He was not cruel. He was a great deal worse than cruel. He was reasonable. He had the law itself on his side, and the paper of it in his hand, and the whole immovable weight of the way things are, and always have been standing square behind him. And Verity Sparrow stood at her own mended gate with her father dying a single wall away, and heard that her home was to be taken from her, and her whole young life of freely given grace was to be repaid at the last with a plow drawn through her mother's garden. And she did not weep, and she did not beg, and she did not rage, and she did not fall. She said, "Thank you for coming to tell me yourself, Mr. Hook, and to my face. It was more than the law obliged you to do, and I mark it." A pause, steady. "I would ask one thing of you, if I may. My father hasn't long, a matter of days now, I think, not weeks. I would ask that you not speak of this where he can hear it, nor send your men about the land within his sight, until he's gone. I'd not have his last days on this earth troubled with the knowledge that his girl's to be turned out the moment he's cold. Grant me that, and I'll give you no other trouble, and I'll be gone within your 30 days, and the place swept clean for your grazier." And Mr. Hook, who had come braced and armored against tears and curses and a woman screaming, and had got instead a courtesy so quiet and so complete that it turned his own hard business back on him like a mirror, Mr. Hook took off his hat. He had not meant to. I watched him do it as though his own hand had betrayed him. And he said, gruff and low and not meeting her eye, that he would grant her that, and that he'd keep his men off the near land till it was over, and that he stumbled on the word as though it were a stone in his boot, that he was sorry for her trouble. And he put his hat back on and gathered his 2 men with a jerk of his head and went. And I do not believe that man had ever in the whole course of his tidy, successful life been so thoroughly and so gently beaten by any living soul as he was that morning by a poor girl at a broken gate. And I do not believe he understood, walking away, that he had been beaten at all, only that he felt, unaccountably, like a smaller man than he had felt riding in. But I saw what it cost her the moment his back was fairly turned. I saw her put out one hand and take hold of the gate-post, the gate my master had mended true, as though the solid earth had tilted under her feet and she must hold to something or go down with it. I dropped the roots and went to her. "Mistress," I began. "Don't," she said, not sharply, almost gently. "Don't be kind to me just this minute, Josiah, I beg you, or I shan't be able to stand up. I can bear the rest of it. I've borne worse. But I can't bear kindness on top of it, not just now. Kindness is the one thing that breaks me clean through. Let me be hard a little longer." And she straightened her back by main force, and smoothed her apron flat with both hands, and lifted her chin, and went in through the Mendied gate to sit with her dying father and let him beat her at a game of draughts, and to say nothing whatever of what had just been done to her, and to carry the whole crushing weight of it entirely alone, because that, God help her, was the only way she had ever been taught that a thing could be carried. I went and found my master. He had heard. He was standing just within the cottage door in the shadow of it, where he had heard every flat, reasonable word of it come in through the open window, and his ragged coat and his splinted wrist and his still white face made a strange and terrible thing of what was in his eyes, which was not coldness now, not the old frost, but a fury I had not seen in that man even at the edge of his brother's open grave. That land, he said, very low, very level, which in him was the most dangerous voice there is. Hook, the Kelby baronetcy, Josiah, I hold the mortgages on the better half of Sir Giles Kelby's estate. That idle fool owes my house £11,000 and has done for years. I could ruin his agent with a single letter written before dinner. I could buy the whole eastern march of this valley outright before Michaelmas Day and never once feel the want of the money, and give her this cottage freehold and every field that touches it, hers forever, and call it a morning's small work. His good hand, I saw, was shaking. I could set this entire thing right with one word, with my name, with the single thing I have not let myself be in this house for a month. He turned his eyes on me, and there was true agony in them, the agony of a man torn exactly down his middle. And the very instant I do it, Josiah, the instant the word Aldermore comes into this cottage, it is over. Do you see? Everything she has shown me becomes, in the telling of it after, a thing she showed a man who turned out to be able to save her. Or worse, it becomes a thing I bought, her rescue and her heart along with it paid for with a deed, and I shall never, so long as I live, be certain again of whether one moment of what I saw in this house was true, or whether I only bought it late, the way I have bought everything else my whole cold life. He drew a hard breath. I have to choose, old man. I can keep the one clean, unbought thing and lose her home to the plow. Or I can save her home and lose forever the certainty of the clean thing. I cannot have both. If I stay Alaric, I keep the truth and she loses the roof over her head. If I become the Duke, I save the roof and I lose the truth. And I, old Josiah, who had begun the whole of this a month before with one reckless dare thrown at a window, said to my master, then the wisest words I have ever in my long life said to any man, and the only truly wise ones, and I did not know as I said them that they were wise until they were already out of my mouth and past calling back. My lord, I said, you have got the whole of it backwards, and it's the grief in you that's turned it round. The truth is not the thing you're protecting on its shelf. The truth is the thing she has already given you, and it is already given, and it is done, and there is not one thing you can do now to ungive it or to spoil it. She saved a beggar. She has done it. It happened out there in the rain and the mud, before you were anything on this earth to her but a stranger bleeding in her road, before there was any name or any purse to muddy it. It is true, and it is hers, and it is yours, and it is finished, and nothing you choose to do from this minute forward can reach back into that rain and dirty it. It is safe. It is the safest thing you own. I stepped nearer to him. So the only question that's left standing in front of you, my lord, is not how to keep the truth safe. The truth is already safe. The only question left is what a man does with a grace like that once he has been given it. And you have got but two answers to choose between. You can hoard it. You can sit up here safe and clean in your certainty and let her lose her home and her mother's garden to Hook's plow, so that your one clean thing can stay clean and untouched on its shelf forever, while the woman who gave it to you sleeps in a hedge. Or you can answer it, my lord. You can turn the other cheek to your own cold heart, the way she turns hers to a whole valley of ingrates, and do for her the very thing she did for you. Help, at a real cost to yourself, expecting not one thing back. That is not the spoiling of her grace, my lord. That is the only fit reply there is to it. Grace answered with grace. She'll not think a jot less of you for turning out to be a duke. I'd stake my soul on it. But she'll think less of you, and so will God, and so will I. If a duke stood a month in her house and warmed himself at her fire and ate from her poor pot, and watched her lose the whole of everything to keep his little secret comfortable and safe. He stared at me a very long while. The fire ticked. In the inner room I could hear the old man's thin laugh and Verity's voice, light, pretending nothing was wrong in all the world. And then Alaric Vane, the cold Duke of Aldermore, who had not wept one tear at the side of his own brother's grave 3 years gone, put his good hand up over his eyes and stood there in the doorway of a poor healer's cottage and was silent behind it a long time. And when at last he took the hand down, his face had changed the way a landscape changes when a long hard frost finally lets go its grip in the night. And I knew, looking at it, that the ice I had set out a month before to crack a little had gone out at last, entirely, with the whole of the tide. "Tomorrow," he said, and his voice was rough. "Not today, not while Hook's men are near enough to make some low public show of it. Tomorrow I will go home, Josiah, to the hall, and then I will come back. And when I come back, I will come back as what I am, in my own coat, and I will let her make of it whatever she chooses to make of it. And if she can find it in her to forgive a man a month of half-truths told out of grief and cowardice, then I will spend the whole of the rest of my life answering what she showed me on that road." He drew a breath that shook. "But she is to hear it from my own mouth, plainly and freely, before ever she hears the word Duke spoken. I'll not have her home saved for her, as a trap she cannot in decency say no to. I'll tell her who I am and what I have come to feel, and I'll give her clean leave to send me off down the lane if that's her will. And then, whatever she chooses to do with me, sent off or kept, married or refused, that land is made over to her freehold and clear before the week is out, hers forever with no condition upon it and no man able to undo it. The rescue is hers no matter what she does with my heart. That much, at the least, I can make honest." Old Thomas Sparrow died that same night. Quietly, in his sleep in the small hours, my master holding one of his worn hands and Verity holding the other. The two of them either side of him in the candlelight, the way the old man had once said, dry and easy, that he'd like to go if the choosing were his, not alone, and not making a fuss of it. He simply breathed out once, and did not trouble to breathe in again, and was gone, and the room was very quiet, and Verity laid his hand down gentle on the coverlet and closed his eyes with 2 fingers, the same sure fingers that had closed 100 other eyes in that valley, and she did not weep even then, because there was the laying out to do first, and she would do right by her father before she would let herself feel anything at all. And in the gray of the morning my master and I rode up out of Marin Coombe. Verity stood at the mended gate in her plain dark mourning and watched the two of us go, believing, I know it now, though I did not fully feel it then, believing that she was losing the one man who had stood at her back, on the very morning she had her father to bury and her 30 days begun to count. She did not weep at that either. She lifted one hand. My master turned in the saddle and looked back at her the whole length of that lane, and did not call out the truth to her, because he had sworn to himself to tell it properly and to her face or not at all, and I thought the heart in him would split clean in 2 before ever we cleared the top of the valley and lost the sight of her. It took 3 days at the hall, and they were 3 days I would not care to live again, for my master worked like a man with the devil at his heels and no patience left for any delay. 3 days of lawyers roused from their beds and mortgages hauled out of strongboxes, and a letter written to Sir Giles Kelby, in the town that made that idle, frightened, indebted man very glad indeed to sell his whole troublesome eastern march to his powerful neighbor, and be quit at a stroke of the debts that had been strangling him for years. 3 days in which the freehold of the cottage, and the garden, and the good black bottom land and every field that bordered it, were made over clean and clear and forever, and unconditionally, to Verity Sparrow, spinster, of Marin Coombe in the county, in a deed that asked her for precisely nothing in return, that named no condition upon its face, that no court in the land and no agent living could ever after undo or question. My master read every word of it twice over himself. He had it witnessed and sealed. He folded it into his breast, and on the fourth morning he dressed. I dressed him myself, as I had done 10,000 mornings. It had been a full month since he had worn his own clothes, and it was a strange thing to do, like dressing a man who had been away at sea and come home altered. The dark coat, so finely cut it seemed a different order of thing from the rag he'd worn. The white linen, the signet of Aldermore going back unto his hand at last, the ring he had not worn in a month. The whole weight and gloss and gravity of what he was, settling back down onto the shoulders of the man who had spent 30 days as a nameless beggar and would never again, I think, be quite so cold a duke as he had been before that beggar's month. He looked at himself a long moment in the tall glass. "She will hardly know me, Josiah," he said, and there was fear in it. "She'll know you, my lord," I said, and I meant it for comfort and I meant it for truth. "It's the one thing in all the world she's certain of, the man you are under the coat. The coat is nothing. It never was anything. She's the one soul alive who's always known that." He rode back down into Marencombe on a gray and gold afternoon at the head of a small train, for it could not be helped, and he did not try to help it. A duke does not travel his own new-bought lands alone, and there was the deed to carry safe and men to carry it and horses fit to be seen. And the whole village came pouring out to line the lane and see, for a duke had not set his living foot in that poor forgotten valley in the memory of the oldest man in it. The parson came, bowing low and often, the same parson who had slid his bolt against a bleeding stranger in the rain. Mr. Hook came, gone gray in the face, for he had heard already by the swift roads such news travels what letters had lately passed between the Hall and Sir Giles Kelby, and he knew before ever my master reached the gate that his little enclosure was dead in the ground, and his own good place likely dead beside it. The prosperous farmers came, and the farmer's wife who would have loosed her dogs on us, and the landlord of the Bell who had turned us out into the rain, and they lined that muddy lane and pulled their forelocks low, and had no notion in the world, not one of the whole staring crowd of them, that the great cold duke they were gaping at, and bowing to, was the very same broken beggar they had left a month before to bleed against their own churchyard wall. Only I knew. I rode a little behind him, and I watched my master ride down that lane through the whole assembled village of people who had every one of them shut their doors against him, and he did not turn his head to look at a single one of them, not the parson, not Hook, not one. He looked only, the whole way down, at the last cottage, the poorest, at the very foot of the village by the stream, and at the girl in her plain black who had come out to her mended gate to see what all the noise and the horses could mean, with her father but 3 days in the churchyard ground. He drew rein at her gate, he swung down. And there, in front of the whole staring, bowing, breath-held village of Marencombe, Alaric Vane took off his hat to Verity Sparrow, the way Mr. Hook had not thought to do until she shamed it out of him, the way not one living soul in that whole valley had ever once in her life troubled to take off a hat to the poor healer's girl, and he stood before her bareheaded, and I watched her face travel in the space of 3 heartbeats from plain bewilderment at the sight of the horses, to a slow and dawning and dreadful recognition of the man beneath the fine coat, to something after that which I have never found the word for, and have stopped trying to. "You," she said, only that, barely aloud. "Alaric Vane," he said, "the Duke of Aldermore. I told you my true name at the least, I never once told you the rest of it, and for that I have come to answer to you." His voice was not cold now, and it was not steady, and before the whole village he let it not be steady, and did not care. "I came down into this county a month ago in a poor man's coat, out of pride and out of grief, to prove to my old servant here that there was no honest kindness left anywhere in the world that my rank had not first bought and paid for. And every door in Aldermore shut in my face and proved me right until I bled in your road, and you, who did not know my name from a tramp's, who could gain nothing on this earth by me, took a broken stranger up out of the mud and into your own house and mended him and warmed him and shared your poor pot with him and asked him for nothing, not once, not ever." He drew the folded deed from his breast and held it out to her across the gate. "This is the freehold of your home, and the garden, and the land Hook would have put to the plow over your father's grave. made over to you in your own name forever, with no condition set upon it and no man living able to undo it. It is yours whatever you say to me from this moment on. I'll not have you think for one heartbeat that your roof hangs upon your answer to me. That debt is paid, and it was always mine to pay, and it is done, and it stands whether you ever speak to me again or no. He held it out. She did not take it. She stood at her own gate, white as the shroud she had lately sown, and the whole village held its breath as one, and when she spoke it was low and fierce and pitched for him and me alone, though I think the nearest of them caught the shape of it. You let me nurse you, she said. You let me spend my father's medicines on your fever, medicines I cannot easily buy again. You let me have my pot with you when I had little enough to have, and you let me grieve, that gray morning, to watch you ride away as if I were losing something. And the whole month long you were the richest man in the county, playing at being a beggar to win an argument with your servant. Her voice shook, but not with tears, with something harder and truer than tears. Do you know what you have cost me, Alaric? Do you know how small it makes a woman feel, to stand here and learn that the beggar she was proud to be kind to never needed her kindness at all, that he had a great house and a warm bed and 100 servants the whole time, and was only warming his cold heart at her poor fire for a month to see how the low folk live and love? And this is the thing, of all the things in this long story, that I will treasure until they lay me in my own ground beside old Thomas. My master did not defend himself. He did not say, but I mended your gate. He did not say, but I sat 3 nights with your dying father so that you could sleep, but I cleared your chimney, but I have given you the very land beneath your feet. He stood bareheaded in the mud of her lane, the greatest man for 40 miles, and he bowed his head before a healer's daughter in mourning black, and he said, It makes you nothing in the world but great, and me nothing but ashamed. You are right to be angry, and you would be right to send me from your gate this minute, and I would go and count it just. I deceived you, and I have no excuse to offer for it but a coward's, and I will give you the coward's excuse plainly rather than dress it up. I had not once in 3 years felt myself a man rather than a purse until I lay in your house, and there, for the first time since I buried my brother, I did, and I could not bear to give it up again before I was sure of it. That was selfish. Your kindness deserved my honesty, and I paid it back in a month of half-truths, and I am sorry for it. From the bottom of a heart I did not so much as know I still had left in me until you were kind to it in the rain. The land is yours no matter what you do with me now. But I did not ride back down into this valley for the sake of the land. He lifted his head then and looked at her, only at her, the whole village gone to smoke and shadow at the edges of him. I rode back because there is one door in all my broad county that opened to me when I stood at it with nothing, one, out of every door I own, and I have found that I cannot go on living behind all my own shut ones any longer. I came back to ask the woman who showed her grace to a beggar whether she might, if I spend the rest of my life earning it, find any grace left over for a proud and frozen and foolish duke. Not to be my rescuer, God knows you have rescued me past all deserving already, but to be my wife. To let me spend what years are left me learning at your side, to give the way that you give. I have no right on this earth to ask it of you. I am asking it of you anyway, and before all these people who would not open their doors, so that you may say no to me as freely and as publicly as you please. The village had gone wholly silent, not a cough, not a shifted foot. The parson's mouth hung open in his soft face. Mr. Hook, a little way off, had taken his hat clean off and was turning it round and round in his 2 hands and looking at the ground. And Verity Sparrow, 3 days orphaned, a month deceived, standing at her own gate in her mother's mended black, with the deed to her whole life held out to her across it by the greatest man in the county, in front of every last soul who had ever spurned her or slandered her or shut a door in her tired face. Verity looked at him a long, long while, a very long while. And then the anger went out of her face slowly, not breaking but simply easing. the way the ice goes off a pond in the first true warmth of the year, not with a crack but by quietly becoming water again. And what stood underneath the anger when it had all gone was the very same thing that had knelt down in the mud beside a bleeding stranger a month before and looked up at me through the rain and asked, "Did I ask you for money?" "My father told me," she said, and now her voice was low and unsteady in a different way, "that the ones who deserve grace the least are most often the very ones who have been given the least of it all their lives, and that's why they've gone so hard." The smallest, most trembling beginning of a smile touched her mouth. I did not think, when he said it to me, that he could have meant dukes, but I suppose a great cold house can starve a man of it as surely as a poor cold one. She looked at the deed in his hand, and then she did not reach for the deed. She reached instead, slowly, and put her own hand over his hand that held it, over the signet ring of Aldermore, over the fine glove, over the whole weight of what he was, and she closed his fingers gently back around the folded paper. "You mended my gate, Alaric," she said, one-handed, cursing the whole time, in the cold. "A man doesn't do that to win an argument with his servant." She left her hand where it was over his. "Keep it. Bring it to the church when you bring me there. I'll not have my home be a thing you gave me to salve your conscience. I'll have it be a thing that we hold the two of us together, and no man able to put us out of it." And then, at the last, in a clear voice pitched now for the whole silent, humbled, staring village of Marin come to hear and carry to their own shut doors, "Yes, God help the pair of us. Yes. I am an old man now, and I have told this story a great many times to a great many people, and I always want to stop it there, at the gate, at her hand over his, at the yes, because that is the place where the cold went out of my master forever and the warmth came into him, and never after left. But people will always ask what came of it after, and so I will tell you the rest quickly, in the plain way she herself liked a thing told, with no fuss made of it. They were married in the little lopsided church whose parson had bolted his door against a bleeding man, and that same parson performed the office with his hands trembling so that he near dropped the book, and afterward my master gave him a purse for the poor of the parish larger than that man had seen gathered in one place in the whole of his soft life, and said to him only, mild as new milk, "For the next stranger who bleeds in your road, Reverend, see that the door is open to him. I shall ask after it. I do not believe that door was ever bolted against a stranger again while that parson lived, and I count that among the smaller miracles of the business. She would not let him make her over into something she was not. He wanted, at the first, to dress the new Duchess of Aldermore in silk from head to foot, and shut her safe up in the great house behind her own gates, the way great men do with the things they love and fear to lose. And she wore the silk to please him, and looked very fine in it, and then rolled its fine sleeves up to the elbow and went straight back to the setting of bones. There is a whole wing of Aldermore Hall given over now to the sick poor of the entire county, endowed forever, and the Duchess is to be found in it most days of the week with her sleeves pinned back and a smudge of some salve on her cheek. And the great cold hall that had not heard a kind word spoken in it in 3 long years is grown to be the warmest house in the whole shire, so that folk come to its doors now from 3 counties over, not for its grandeur but for its welcome. And the man who is master of it, who once stood at a window and told his old servant there was nothing under the world's smiles but bared teeth, learned at his wife's side to give, and to give, and to give again, and never once to fret himself over the sorting of the deserving from the undeserving. Mr. Hook, and this surprised the whole county, and it surprised me, my master kept him on. He did not turn him off, though he had every right and every reason. He kept the man on and made him steward of the very eastern lands he had bought out from under Sir Giles, the very land Hook had meant to plough over Verity's garden, and when I made bold to ask my master why in the world he would do such a thing, he looked at me with the beginning of that smile he smiles so easily now, and he said, "Verity says the ones who deserve it least." And Hook, when I came to look into him, deserved it very little and had been given a great deal less, by a hard father and a harder master, all his life. He is the best and the honestest steward in 3 counties now, Josiah, and he'd walk into a fire for her, and there's not an enclosure gone up on my land since. Grace. It is the only thing I ever saw in my life that could work upon a hard man from the inside. I ought to know it as well as any man breathing. I was one, and it was worked upon me at a broken gate in the rain. And as for me, I never lost that argument at the window. I said the word kindness to my master 1,000 times more in the years that followed, and he never once again told me to hold my tongue upon the subject. And on the day he finally made me leave off my service, too old and too stiff at last to lift a boot or stand a night's watch, he did a thing for a manservant that I have never heard of any duke doing before or since. He sat me down by his own fire, in the warm house his wife had made warm, and he thanked me plainly to my face, without dressing it up for having dared, that gray morning 33 years his servant, to throw one reckless dare at a cold man at a window. You gambled my whole life, Josiah, he said, on the goodness of a stranger in a valley neither of us had ever heard the name of. I did, my lord, I said, and I won. He smiled. He smiles very easily now. It is the least remarkable thing about him, and it is the thing I am the proudest of in all my 30 years of service. And he looked across the warm, bright room to where his duchess sat with a young one nodding on her lap and another's grazed knee to bind before bed, and no more notion of her own greatness than she had ever had in her life, sleeves pinned back, humming some old air of her mother's. And he was quiet a moment, watching her, and then he said, low, so that only an old man near the fire could hear it. So did I, old friend. So did I, by the widest margin in the whole history of the world, so did I.